My name is Gerald Whitmore, and 4 years ago, my ex-wife Sandra took everything I had spent 31 years building. The sheep station outside Masterton, 1,800 acres of Wairarapa hill country that my grandfather had broken in by hand, that my father had expanded through drought and flood, and that I had turned into the most productive merino operation in the lower North Island. Gone. The wool processing shed I'd built from scratch in 2003, complete with the grading equipment and the cool store. Gone. Even Bramble, my 12-year-old border collie who had worked beside me since she was 8 weeks old, who knew every paddock and every mob of sheep on that land better than most people know their own street. Gone. Sandra's lawyers made sure of it. The settlement papers landed on the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in March, the week after I turned 61. I came in from checking the ewes at first light, pulled off my boots at the door, the way I had done for 3 decades, and found them sitting there, next to my cold cup of tea. Sandra had driven to Wellington the night before to stay with her sister, she'd said. She hadn't mentioned the lawyers. I stood there in my stockinged feet, reading words like irretrievable breakdown and equitable division of matrimonial property, while the dogs barked outside, and the mob in the home paddock waited for me to bring their morning feed. I read those papers 3 times. Then I put on my boots again and went out to feed the sheep, because the sheep still needed feeding. And I didn't know what else to do. She hadn't always been like this. When Sandra and I met in 1989, she was a bookkeeper from Carterton, with a practical mind and a laugh that could fill a shearing shed. We built something together, or I thought we did. She managed the accounts, handled the wool contracts, raised our 2 daughters, Philippa and Rose, while I ran the station. For 28 years, we worked alongside each other the way you work a team of dogs, each knowing their role, each trusting the other. Then her brother Craig came back from Brisbane. Craig Ashworth had spent 15 years in Queensland doing what he called property development and what I called convincing people to buy things they didn't need. He came back to New Zealand in 2019 with a leased BMW, a new wife half his age, and a briefcase full of schemes. Within 6 months, he was having coffee with Sandra every Thursday in Masterton. Within 12 months, she was talking about restructuring the station's asset base and leveraging equity for diversification. I should have understood what was happening. But I was 60 years old, and I had spent 40 years learning to read weather patterns, soil conditions, and wool clip weights. I had not spent nearly enough time learning to read people who meant me harm. The family court proceedings took 11 months. Sandra's lawyer argued that the station's increased value during our marriage represented a joint contribution, and that her years of bookkeeping and domestic work entitled her to a significant share. My lawyer, a decent man named Fletcher who drove up from Wellington each time, told me quietly that the judge was known for generous property division. He was right. Sandra received the station, the processing shed, and primary residence of both daughters. I received a payout of $380,000, a sum that sounds substantial until you understand it represented roughly 12% of what I had actually built. Craig stood outside the courthouse that afternoon, wearing a smile I wanted to remove from his face. Sandra wouldn't meet my eyes. She said something about how I would understand someday that this was best for everyone. Bramble was already gone. Sandra had arranged for the station's new manager, one of Craig's contacts from Queensland, to take over, and he had decided the old dog was surplus to requirements. A neighbor later told me they'd seen Craig loading her into his ute the week before the hearing. I told myself she'd gone to a good farm. I had to tell myself something. At 61 years old, I moved into a 2-bedroom flat in Greytown that smelled of someone else's cooking. I had $380,000. No stock, no land, and no idea what a man my age does when the only life he has known is suddenly someone else's property. I found work the only way that made sense. A transport company in Featherston needed someone to drive stock trucks on the early morning runs, picking up from farms around the Wairarapa, delivering to the fielding saleyards or the processing plants in Leven. It was 5-hour round trips starting at 4 in the morning. which suited me because I had never been able to sleep past 4 anyway. And because being around livestock, even briefly, felt like holding on to something. The other drivers were 20 years younger than me. They were polite, in the way young people are polite to someone their grandfather's age. Careful, slightly distant, never quite sure what to talk about. I didn't mind. I had the radio and the roads I had driven all my life. And that was enough. My daughters called when they could. Philippa, the elder one, had married and moved to Napier. She rang every Sunday and tried not to mention the station or her mother in the same conversation. Rose was still at Massey, studying agricultural science, living on campus, caught between her parents, in the way children always are when a marriage comes apart at 60. I didn't ask them to choose. I didn't want them to carry that. The routine kept me sane. Wake at 3:30, drive by 4, collect the stock, deliver, return, eat something from a can or a pie warmer, sleep for a few hours, repeat. I drove 6 days a week and saved almost everything I earned, though I couldn't have told you what I was saving for. Habit, I suppose. The same instinct that made my grandfather put a little back even in the bad years. It was on a Tuesday in late July, 14 months after the settlement, that everything changed. I was doing the early Masterton run, picking up from 3 farms in the Tararua foothills and heading to Fielding. The last pickup was a small beef operation outside Eketahuna, run by an elderly widow named Mrs. Parada, who was dispersing her herd before moving into town. She came out in the dark with a torch to count the cattle on, which I appreciated. And when we were done, she pressed a thermos of tea on me and insisted I drink it before I left. I was standing beside the truck in the dark, drinking the best cup of tea I had in months, when her phone rang inside the house. She excused herself and went in. The truck was loaded, the paperwork was signed, but I waited because she'd been kind to me, and it seemed wrong to simply drive away. When she came back out, she was different. The capable, organized woman who had counted 15 cattle in the dark had gone pale and uncertain. She was holding her phone with both hands. "That was my solicitor," she said, "about my late husband's estate. There's been some kind of complication with the Tauranga property. Something about a trust structure nobody knew about." I asked if she was all right. She looked at me for a moment in the light from her porch. "I don't know yet," she said. "Did you know my husband by any chance?" "Owen Parada. He worked in Auckland for most of his life before we came here." I told her I didn't think so. She nodded slowly. "He was a quiet man, kept things to himself. I thought I knew him completely," she said. And then she laughed, though it didn't sound like something that came easily, apparently not quite completely. I wished her well with the solicitor and drove north into the dark. I thought about what she'd said for most of the 5 hours to Fielding and back. A man who kept things to himself. A trust structure nobody knew about. I thought about my own father, who had died in 1998, and how certain I was that I knew everything about him. A straightforward Wairarapa farmer. Church on Sundays, labor on election day, hated waste and dishonesty in equal measure. I had never once questioned that picture. 2 weeks later, I was cleaning out the last of the storage boxes I'd taken from the station. Things Sandra's lawyers had deemed personal rather than matrimonial property, and therefore mine to keep. Most of it was old farm records, vaccination logs, wool clip summaries, going back to my father's time. I kept those. The rest was personal effects. School reports, old photographs, the kind of paper accumulation that follows a family through decades without anyone quite deciding to keep it or throw it away. At the bottom of the second-to-last box, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. It was addressed to my father, Gerald Whitmore, RD2 Masterton, in handwriting I didn't know. The postmark was 1979. I would have been 16 in 1979, working after school and through every holiday on the station beside my father. who I thought I knew as well as any son knows his father. The letter inside was from a firm of solicitors in Hamilton, Guthrie and Associates. The letterhead was old-fashioned, the type slightly uneven, the way it gets with an older machine. It informed my father that his brother Thomas had made a significant change to a discretionary trust established in 1971, and that Donald Whitmore remained a named beneficiary along with Thomas's own children, and that upon Thomas's death the trustee would be in contact to advise on distributions. I sat on the floor of my Greytown flat for a long time. I had no Uncle Thomas. I had been told my entire life that my father was an only child. His parents had come from Southland. His father had died young. His mother had followed 10 years later, and there were no other Whitmores. That was the family story. I had never had reason to question it. I read the letter 4 more times. Then I searched the rest of the box with the methodical attention I had once given to checking a mob of sheep for foot rot, examining everything, dismissing nothing. At the very bottom, folded inside an old vaccination record from 1981, was a second letter. This one was handwritten, on plain paper, with no letterhead. It was addressed to my father in a different hand from the first letter, more personal, and began, "Don, I know you don't want to hear from me, and I understand why, but I want you to know that what Father did was wrong, and I never agreed to it. You were his son the same as I was. I'm putting this right the only way I can. The trust will look after your boy when the time comes. He won't know where it comes from, and perhaps that's best, but he'll have what he needs. Whatever happens between us, he's my nephew, and he deserves his share. Tom." I rang Philippa that night. She drove down from Napier the next morning. We sat at my small kitchen table with both letters between us and a pot of tea going cold while we talked it through. Philippa had inherited her mother's practical mind before Sandra had allowed Craig to redirect it, and she worked through the implications steadily. "Your grandfather had 2 sons," she said finally. "Your father and this Thomas. They were estranged, seriously estranged, if your father never mentioned him once in his entire life. But Thomas wanted to make it right through you, and the trust has apparently been sitting there since 1979. I said. "Or longer. We need to find Guthrie and Associates," she said. The firm no longer existed under that name. 45 years is a long time for a legal practice to stay unchanged, and Guthrie and Associates had been absorbed into a larger Hamilton firm called Patterson Keene in the mid-1990s. I found this out through the New Zealand Law Society, which took 3 phone calls and most of a morning. A helpful woman there confirmed that client records would transfer when firms merge, and suggested I contact Patterson Keene directly with the original correspondence. I drove to Hamilton on a Thursday, having rung ahead to make an appointment with a senior partner named Vivian Taufa, who handled estate and trust matters. She was in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried in the way of someone who has spent decades dealing with other people's complicated family situations and has learned to be unsurprised. She looked at both letters for a long time without speaking. Then she excused herself, was gone for 20 minutes, and came back carrying a manila folder that was thick enough to have been growing in a filing cabinet since before I had started farming. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, sitting down and folding her hands on the folder. "I want to be careful about what I tell you before I've confirmed certain things. But I can tell you that we do have records relating to a Thomas Whitmore trust established in 1971, and that the beneficial interests in that trust have never been formally distributed." She paused. There was a named heir. The documentation refers to the son of Donald Whitmore. It took some time to locate a living party matching that description, and then the trust administrator, who retired in 2008 and passed away in 2014, appears to have allowed the matter to lapse. "What does lapsed mean in this context?" I asked. "It means nobody told you," she said, with a directness I appreciated. "It doesn't mean the entitlement went away." She needed several weeks to verify documentation, contact the trust's current custodian bank, and assess the current position of the assets. Thomas Whitmore, it emerged, had been a successful commercial property developer in the Waikato and Bay of Plenty through the 1970s and 1980s. He had died in 1994. I would have been 31, still building the station, wrapped up in ewes and wool prices, and the arrival of Philippa. His own children had received their shares of his estate directly. The trust, established separately decades before his death, and structured in a specific way for reasons that were now only partially clear from the documentation, had continued to hold and grow a collection of commercial properties and investments. Over 30 years of growth. Vivienne rang me on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after my first visit to Hamilton. I was sitting in my flat eating toast for dinner when the phone went. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I've completed the assessment. I'd like you to come in on Monday if you can." I asked if she could give me a sense of what we were talking about. There was a brief pause. "I think Monday is better," she said. "But I will tell you that you should probably arrange for Philippa to come with you, if she's available." The trust held commercial property interests in Hamilton, Tauranga, and Rotorua, along with a managed investment portfolio that the custodian bank had been running conservatively for decades. The total current value, Vivienne told us on that Monday morning, sitting across the table from me and Philippa with the thick folder open between us, was approximately $4.2 million. Philippa put her hand on my arm. I looked at Vivienne and asked her to repeat the number. She did. My Uncle Thomas, a man I had never met, whose existence had been kept from me my entire life, who had sent a handwritten letter to a brother who apparently never forgave him for whatever had happened between them, had spent 23 years building something he couldn't give me directly and had trusted a legal structure to deliver it after he was gone. I thought about the letter. He won't know where it comes from, and perhaps that's best. But he'll have what he needs. I had to excuse myself and walk to the window for a moment. Below, Hamilton went about its Thursday morning. People crossed the street. A courier van idled at a loading zone. Pigeons investigated a dropped pie on the footpath. Ordinary life. Continuing as it does, indifferent to the fact that a 62-year-old man in a law firm on the 3rd floor had just discovered that someone he never knew had loved him from a distance for half a century. "Are you all right, Dad?" Philippa asked behind me. I told her I needed another minute. The practical matters took several months to resolve. The commercial properties were managed assets. I had no desire to become a property developer at 62, and Vivienne's advice was to retain the professional management already in place and allow the portfolio to continue generating income. The investment portion was restructured into something more appropriate for my circumstances and reviewed by a financial advisor she recommended in Hamilton. What I did not do was ring Sandra. She heard, of course. Word moves through Wairarapa social networks with the efficiency of a southerly change, and within 3 weeks of the Hamilton meeting becoming even moderately public knowledge, I received a message through Philippa. Sandra wanted to discuss the girls' financial future. She felt there might be grounds to revisit the settlement, given materially changed circumstances. I spoke to Fletcher, my lawyer. He was matter-of-fact. The inheritance postdated the settlement by more than a year, he said. It arrived through a trust your ex-wife had no knowledge of and no claim on. Her argument has no merit. If she pursues it, we respond accordingly. She did not pursue it. Craig, I later heard, had advised her not to. Whatever else Craig was, he apparently knew which battles to avoid. Bramble died that winter, I found out through a neighbor who had stayed in touch. The new station manager had apparently kept her after all, and she'd lived out her last months doing what she had always done, working the paddocks she knew. I was glad of that. I had been worried for nothing on that score. And the relief was unexpectedly strong for an old man sitting in a flat in Greytown, hearing second-hand news about a dog. I bought a small farm in the Manawatu the following spring. 70 acres outside Fielding, which is modest by Wairarapa standards, but which suited what I had in mind. Not a commercial sheep operation this time. Something different. I had spent 14 months driving stock trucks past farms belonging to other people. Watching the land the way you watch something you love but can no longer touch. In that time, I had thought carefully about what I actually wanted, which is something a man in his 60s ought to do more than most of us manage. The answer surprised me a little. I didn't want the scale of the old station. I wanted the work. I wanted the early mornings and the dogs and the paddocks and the seasonal rhythms that had structured my entire adult life. I wanted to be useful in ways I understood. The Manawatu property had good bones, sound fencing, reliable water, a modest 3-bedroom house that needed paint but not rebuilding. I ran a small mob of merinos for the pleasure of it, contracted a neighbor to help at shearing, and spent the rest of my time doing something I had thought about for years but never had the space for, training working dogs for young farmers. I had 3 dogs within the first year. 2 of them were from bloodlines I knew. The third was a young bitch from a Hawke's Bay breeder who had what I can only describe as an unusual quality of attention. She watched, and she waited, and she understood before you finished the command. I called her Fern, which was Rose's idea. Rose had graduated by then, was working for a farm consultancy in Palmerston North, and drove over most Sunday afternoons to help with the dogs and eat whatever I had managed to cook. Philippa brought her husband and the grandchildren down 3 times that first year. We had the kind of Sundays that the old station had rarely produced. Too busy, too driven. Always something that needed doing before we could sit down. Now, I sat down. Now I made time, which is something you can only do when you stop believing that more is always better. My mother had told me once, when I was young and impatient about something I have long forgotten, that a person reveals their true character not in what they build but in what they do when the building is taken from them. I had thought about that on the stock truck on many a dark morning on the Pahiatua track. I thought about Thomas Whitmore, my uncle, who had apparently been cut out of his own family or had cut himself out. The records were not entirely clear, and had spent 20 years building something he could only give to a nephew he was never allowed to meet. That is a particular kind of love. Quiet, patient, structural, the kind that does not announce itself. I think about what it cost him. Not the money, which was considerable, but not the point. The cost of watching from a distance, of knowing a wrong had been done and being able to address it only indirectly, only through documents and trust deeds and a handwritten letter to a brother who may never have read it with a charitable eye. My father never spoke of him. Not once. Whatever the original wound was, a family argument over land, over the estate of their own father, over something smaller that grew large. The way small things do when left untended. It was sealed so completely that it had taken a letter in the bottom of a storage box and a chance conversation with a widow in the dark to open it. I have tried to understand my father's silence. He was not a cruel man. He was a product of his generation and his circumstances, which included a belief that certain things were simply not spoken of, and that this restraint was a form of dignity. But silence, I have learned, is not neutral. Silence has consequences that outlast the person who chose it. And those consequences fall on people who had no part in the original decision. I wrote to Thomas Whitmore's children, my cousins, which is a strange word to use for people in their 60s and 70s whom I have never met. I found them through Vivienne, who facilitated the contact carefully. I did not want anything from them. I wanted them to know that their father's gesture had been received, that whatever had happened between 2 brothers in the Waikato half a century ago, the nephew had grown up well and had needed what Thomas left him and was grateful for it. One of them, a woman named Helen who lives in Tauranga, wrote back. Her letter was careful and a little formal, but it was a letter, which is more than there had been for 50 years. She said her father had spoken of his brother Donald rarely, and always with a kind of resigned sadness. She said she had never known why they lost contact. She said she hoped we might meet one day. We have not yet. But the door is open, which is the important thing. Open doors do not close themselves, Rose asked me last spring. Sitting on the back step watching Fern work a small mob in the home paddock, whether I was angry at what Sandra and Craig had done. It was the kind of direct question that Rose has always been comfortable asking and that I have always needed a moment to answer honestly. I told her that I had been angry, fiercely and for a long time, in the way you are angry when someone takes something you have earned through 40 years of early mornings and cold southerlies and the kind of sustained physical work that uses a person up. That anger was legitimate and I do not apologize for it. But I also told her what I had come to understand from the 14 months on the stock truck and the discovery of Thomas's letter and the long quiet of the Manawatu property. That the life Sandra and Craig took was a life I had built around a particular idea of what success looked like. A big station, a large operation, numbers that impressed people at the A&P show. Thomas's gift did not give me that life back, it gave me something else. Something I had not known how to want while I was busy building the version I lost. Rose was quiet for a while, watching Fern bring the mob neatly to the gate. Then she said, "So, the worst thing that happened to you also turned out to be a kind of direction." I said that was about right. Fern looked back at me from the gate, checking, the way a good dog always checks. I sent her around for the last stragglers and she went. Low and fast, and entirely certain of herself. I still drive out to the Tararua foothills sometimes on a Tuesday morning, the same roads I drove on the stock run. I stop at Mrs. Parada's old property, she has her section in town now, and look at the country. You can see a long way from those foothills on a clear day, all the way across the valley to the ranges on the other side, the whole pastoral spread of the Wairarapa laid out below you. And it strikes me every time that the land does not belong to the people who own it, not really. We are custodians for a while. Then it passes on. Thomas understood that. He could not pass the land on to me that was never within his power, but he could pass on what the land had generated, which he did, quietly and patiently, over 23 years. On behalf of a nephew he was prevented from knowing. I think he would have liked the Manawatu place. I think he would have approved of the dogs and the modest mob and the Sunday afternoons and the open door to Helen in Tauranga. I think he was a man who valued things being made right more than he valued being seen to make them right, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that too few people manage. Here is what I have learned, which I offer not as wisdom but simply as the view from 63 years of living, much of it in the particular school of the land. Integrity does not always announce itself. It operates in the background, in trust deeds and handwritten letters and anonymous contributions to a nephew's future. And it may take 50 years and a storage box on a flat floor to come to light. But it comes to light. That is the thing I want you to understand. Patient goodness is not wasted goodness, even when it seems to disappear into silence. A marriage that ends in the family court is not the final verdict on who you are. The settlement papers are a document. They are not a sentence. What you do in the years after those papers is the actual story, and that story is still yours to write at any age. The people who believe they have won by taking what you built are not wrong that they have taken it. They are wrong that taking it was winning. There is a difference between acquiring and deserving, and time tends to make that difference visible. And finally this, which Thomas taught me, without ever being in the same room as me. Love that cannot speak still acts. It finds the available channel, a trust deed, a letter, an anonymous monthly payment, and it moves through that channel quietly and consistently for as long as it takes. If there is someone you love whom circumstances prevent you from reaching, do not let that prevent you from acting on their behalf. The action will arrive, even if the explanation must wait. My name is Gerald Whitmore, nephew of Thomas, And this is my story. If it has meant something to you, if you have ever stood at your own version of rock bottom and wondered whether the ground beneath you might turn out to be solid, then I am glad you stayed to the end. There are more stories on this channel from people who found, in the hardest moments, that they were not as alone as they thought. Subscribe if you would like to hear them. And if someone in your life needs to hear that patience is not the same as defeat, please pass this along. The gate is always worth leaving open. You never know who might come through it.